This is part 1 of the Chapter 5 lecture notes on plant diversity. Okay, there we go. All right, so plants are basically divided into 4 types. There are plants that have vascular tissue. We don't, well, we do call them veins sometimes, like in leaves, we call them, we say that the leaves have veins, but typically you just say vascular tissue. You can't say blood vessels because plants don't have blood, but plants do have vascular tissue, um, a system of vessels that transports, fluids and minerals and nutrients throughout the plant. So there is a group of plants called vascular plants and a group called non-vascular plants. So an example of a non-vascular plant would be a moss, and then your vascular plants can be divided into ones that produce seeds and ones that don't. And then of the ones that produce seeds, they're either naked seeds, like seeds within a cone, such as a pine tree, or they are seeds that are protected by a fruit and a flower. So that's kind of how we're going to study the plants is they're going to be grouped based on those characteristics. But what do all land plants have in common? Um, they all have a life cycle called the alternation of generations. They're going to alternate between 2 different multicellular forms, the sporophyte and the gametophyte. And here they call the structure that produces the spores is called the sporangium. So they have a sporangium in which the spores are formed, and then a gametangium that produces haploid cells. So the sporangium is diploid and the gametangium is haploid. And just like the fungi, the spores themselves are haploid because a spore will germinate into the the gametophyte structure, which contains the gametangium. This is going to be a lot easier whenever you see the life cycles. So for right now, just understand that they alternate between a diploid and a haploid multicellular form. And then plants have apical meristem tissue in their roots and in their shoots. The roots are the below ground parts and the shoots are the above ground parts. So meristem tissue is the tissue at the tips of the branches and the tips of the roots. You've heard the term stem cells. Stem cells in animals or humans are cells that can divide and produce other cells, such as they're embryonic stem cells that can produce more embryonic cells. And then there are stem cells for blood, there's stem cells for bone, but stem cells basically, sorry, stem cells basically are just cells that can divide by mitosis and produce new cells. So the meristem tissue, the apical meristem tissue, is the area of growth. And as far as evolution, land plants appeared, according to the fossil record, about 500 million years ago in the Ordovician period. And I'm sure there's a quiz question on that. The alternation of generations works like this, and this is just a basic general alternation of generations for any type of plant. But just like with the fungal life cycles, we're going to see variations. For each different type of plant, there's variations of the alternation of generation life cycle. So let's start with the, excuse me, let's start with the gametes. I think it's easy if you start with the gametes because these gametes are not labeled male and female. So in most plants, there is a male and a female gamete. And in fact, in most plants, there's a sperm and an egg, just like with animals. But here the gametes are just labeled gametes. So the gametes are haploid. And haploid is everything in yellow. So we know that if it's up here in the yellow part, that the cells are haploid. So the gametes are both haploid. They fuse. We call that fertilization. Here they call it fusion, but it is technically is fertilization. And fertilization produces a diploid zygote, which divides by mitosis. This is just like the same thing that happens in humans. It divides by mitosis and produces a multicellular organism called the sporophyte. And then the sporophyte has certain cells that undergo meiosis. So the sporophyte is diploid, but when it undergoes meiosis and produces spores, those spores are haploid. And those spores, in the more primitive plants, they just land on the ground, and if the conditions are right, if there's enough water and minerals, then they will germinate, and they'll start to divide by mitosis and form the gametophyte structure. And the gametophyte is multicellular also, but all of its cells are haploid. So there's some, basically in the life cycle for plants, there's some similarities with fungi and there are some similarities with animals. So the sporangia is the topic of this slide, the sporangia. Okay, so I told you there were two multicellular forms of the plant in the alternation of generation life cycle. The sporophyte of seedless plants. So right now we're talking about seedless plants. The sporophyte of seedless plants is diploid and results from syngamy or fusion of two gametes, which you can also call that fertilization of two gametes. So those two gametes unite, form a zygote that is diploid, and that zygote grows into a multicellular sporophyte. The sporophyte bears the sporangia. The sporangia are organs that first appeared in the land plants, and the sporangia are multicellular. And there are, inside of the sporangia, there are diploid sporocytes, or mother cells. And those sporocytes undergo meiosis and produce haploid spores. So the sporophyte and the sporangia are diploid, and the sporocytes or mother cells are diploid. But those cells divide by meiosis, and the spores themselves are haploid. And then the spores are released and scattered around in the environment, and they can germinate into a gametophyte. So now we'll talk about that. The gametangia is associated with the gametophyte. So gametangia are structures observed on multicellular haploid gametophyte. And the gametangia contain precursor cells that give rise to gametes by mitosis. So the gametangia are haploid, the gametophyte is haploid, the gametangia are haploid, and they divide by mitosis to produce gametes, which are haploid, okay? But this is where it's different because the gametes are produced by mitosis, not meiosis. We learned that for humans, that the gametes, the sperm and the egg, are produced by meiosis. But the gametes in a plant are produced by mitosis because the structure that produces the gametes is already haploid. So basically you have these haploid gametophytes that divide by mitosis. Sorry. There we go. Okay, so that's what mitosis looks like when the parent cell is already haploid. So the haploid parent cell produces haploid daughter cells, and those daughter cells are the gametes, sperm and egg. There is a male gametangium called the antheridium, and you'll learn to associate anther with the male part of the plant, the word part, anther. So the male gametangium is called the antheridium, and the gametes produced are called sperm. And the seedless plants produce sperm that contain flagella because they have to swim to the egg. The seed plants do not. The seed plants produce pollen, and then the pollen contains the sperm, and the pollen carries the sperm to the egg. All right. The archegonia is the female gametangium, and this is where the egg is produced, and the egg starts out, once the egg is fertilized, it becomes a zygote, which is diploid. The zygote develops into an embryo, and that embryo becomes the sporophyte, and the sporophyte is diploid. All right, we've seen this before. The apical meristem section of this looks very familiar. It looks like the in Bio 111 when we looked at the cells in the tips of onion root tip cells, because those cells were undergoing mitosis, and we could see different stages of mitosis: prophase, metaphase, anaphase, and telophase. And that was part of your lab practical in Bio 111, if you remember. But we used onion root tips because those are regions of growth. Those are regions where cells are dividing. So regions where the shoots and the roots of plants increase in length because cells are dividing are called apical meristem tissue. And this tissue is found at the tips of shoots or roots, It says the apical meristem is made of undifferentiated cells, that means unspecialized cells, that continue to proliferate or grow throughout the life of the plant. Meristematic cells give rise to all the specialized tissues of the organism, just like stem cells give rise to all the specialized tissues, in a human. Elongation of the shoots and roots allows a plant to access additional light, water, and minerals. So growing longer for the roots means that there's greater chance that the roots can reach water that's deeper in the soil. And the same thing for the shoots. The longer that they grow, the very tall trees have access to light more so than short plants. Okay, as far as plant classification, the plants are classified in the supergroup Archaeoplastida. They're classified in with the green algae and the red algae. The land plants are classified in the Archaeoplastida, and then the charophytes are the green algae that are most closely related to land plants. The streptophytes is a name for the group that contains the charophytes and the embryophytes. And the embryophytes is the word for the land plants. So land plants are embryophytes, and they are divided into non-vascular plants and vascular plants. Non-vascular plants are always seedless. They produce spores, but they don't produce seeds. And you may not have heard of liverworts or hornworts, but I'm sure you have heard of mosses and seen mosses growing, on a rock or on the ground, but maybe by a tree. Usually they grow somewhere where the soil is moist at least. I see mosses growing around the tree that's right beside of our pond in our yard, because the soil is moist. But mosses are very short, so are liverworts and hornworts, and they are all classified as bryophytes.